afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center on this very cold Thursday. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. We have a very good audience today. I think we have a lot of Israelis who were snowbound in Jerusalem. They seem to think that snow is a much happier thing than we in Washington think it is, so good for them. We're thrilled, and we hope you keep sending the invitation to these programs to your friends. So before we get started, let me introduce the JPC and our work, and then we will go to our outstanding guest, Dr. Stephen Blank of the United States Institute for Peace and the American Foreign Policy Council. The JPC is a 501c3 organization providing perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policy by leading scholars, academics, and commentators. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. There you'll find our Insight articles, our quarterly magazine, In Focus, and our blog, In Context. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. And today, on Holocaust Memorial Day, especially, we remember that we are committed to the future of a strong and secure Israel. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. We've been all over the world in these calls, from Israel to China to Azerbaijan, Syria, the Gulf, and South America, and some domestic issues as well, including school choice, the Supreme Court, and the American defense budget. Today's subject is Russia and Ukraine and NATO and America. We've seen a lot in the American press over the tensions in Ukraine, but mostly from the vantage point of American policy and the US administration. Today, we're going to look at the other side. We're going to look at Russia with Stephen Blank. And Stephen Blank is an amazing, amazing scholar. We have known each other for many, many years, and I'm thrilled to have him on the program. He is an internationally recognized expert on Russian foreign and defense policies and international relations across the former Soviet Union. He's also a leading expert on European and Asian security, including energy issues, which touches on our subject today as well. He is a senior expert for Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. I think I got that wrong earlier. It's corrected now. From 1989 to 2013, he was professor at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College in Pennsylvania, and he has also taught at the Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base. Dr. Blank has testified before Congress, consulted for the CIA, major think tanks and foundations, chaired major international conferences in the United States, as well as in Florence, Prague, and London. And he's been a commentator and a writer on foreign affairs in the media in the United States and abroad. He is a prolific writer, having published over 1,300 articles and monographs on Soviet and Russian issues, US, Asia, European military and foreign policies, including publishing or editing 15 books. So we've asked him to distill into a program for us all of that understanding in a way that gives us a better understanding of the Russian side of the standoff over Ukraine. Let's see how well he does. And remember, you can send your questions on the Q&A function. I will be monitoring it during the program. Stephen Blank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shoshana. It's a great pleasure to speak to your audience, and I'm looking forward to an invigorating discussion on the crisis around Ukraine. It's not a crisis in Ukraine, as some commentators have said, but around Ukraine. And it's a crisis that is, frankly, wholly manufactured out of thin air. It is unprovoked. There is no NATO threat to Russia at the present moment. There is no NATO threat of membership in Ukraine anytime in the foreseeable future. As a matter of fact, before this, that was about the last thing NATO wanted to talk about. And third, there is no threat from Ukraine to the Russian-controlled army in the Donbass. Ukraine had no plans to go on the offensive. So in other words, this is completely unprovoked threat whereby Vladimir Putin, and he's the only person capable of starting this, has made up his mind, along with that of the Russian establishment, that these three threats that I just described to you actually exist, and that therefore he needs to mobilize what we think is going to be a force of about 150, 175,000 troops, and that comprises ground, sea, and air forces, plus logistics support, etc., to threaten Ukraine. And he's able to threaten it from three sides now because Russian forces are now occupying Belarus, which might have been another objective of all this to begin with. So they are confronting Ukraine from the north, the east, and the south on land, sea, and air, and of course through cyber and electronic means as well. And these are all aspects of what has been a war that has gone on for 8 years. Putin is not about to start a war. He's in the middle of a war with Ukraine. And what's more, and this needs to be understood, he's been at war with the West for the last 15, 17 years. And Russian statesmen have said so. I have the sources if you are interested in that, and I would be happy to furnish anybody with them, where they said in 2004, they're at war with the West. Now, this is not a shooting war with the West, but it was a shooting war with Ukraine, starting in 2014. And that war was predictable. Indeed, this whole crisis was predictable because the declaration by the Russians that the West is at war with them, that's the way they phrase it. I mean, Russia is never responsible for anything bad that happens. It's always the victim in Russian propaganda, is that they tried to subvert the government of Ukraine in 2004 and failed. And of course, the reason they failed is because the Ukrainian population refused to play that game and demonstrated and threw out the corrupt elections and brought in a different president. However, from Moscow's point of view, Ukraine, as Bush memorably told President George Bush, is not a state. It's not even anything. Its territory is essentially stolen from Russia. And therefore, and because revolutions are a matter of conspiracy, which is an old KGB line, the United States is behind all of this, and NATO and the EU, and therefore they're at war with Russia. They are seeking to deny Russia its lawful, legitimate interests, which can be boiled down to a single word: empire. And the re-annexation of Ukraine as under the rubric in Russian history of the gathering of Russian lands. Now, we don't have time to go into the long history of Ukraine's affiliation with Russia and periods when it was not affiliated with Russia. But to Russian elites, almost to a man, and there are very few women in the Russian elite, relatively speaking, so we can use that phrase, Ukraine is part of Russia, or should be. Russia is not complete unless it is Ukraine involved, unless Ukraine is part of it or subordinate to it. And Moscow is not fully legitimate as the ruling city of Russia unless Ukraine is part of it, because Russian history, as everybody acknowledges, starts with Kiev and Rus, where Kiev was the capital. Therefore, if the Ukraine says we're independent and we're leaning towards the West, and in this case, the European Union, they have repudiated the whole narrative of Russian history and have struck at the legitimating basis of Putin's rule. Furthermore, the threat to Putin, and I use the word threat to Putin because nobody is threatening Russia. Nobody in his right mind would dream of that. This is a country, after all, with thousands of nuclear weapons. The threat to Putin is democracy. As Victor Hugo called it, it's an idea with bayonets. But even without bayonets, the idea of democracy in Ukraine is anathema to Putin and must be stopped at all costs. And because Putin passionately believes that the whole Soviet Union was Russia, and has written and said this, and that Ukraine is Russia, and that its territory was stolen from Russia. Therefore, Ukraine is not entitled to an independent life, period. So all the articles you have read where people are saying, well, we need to impose a moratorium on NATO enlargement, or that Ukraine must be neutral, that is imposed neutrality from outside and above, miss the point. Ukraine cannot be independent under Putin's thinking. Neutralism is not enough. Neutrality is not enough. He invaded Ukraine in 2014, even though it was neutral, and its constitution forbade foreign troops. So all the people claiming that political science theory justifies not interfering with other people's sphere of influence misses the point that nobody in Ukraine wants to be part of Russia's sphere of influence. And for that matter, nobody in the CIS really wants to be Russia's sphere of influence. And that the only way Russia has of maintaining empire is by force or by fraud, because it has nothing to offer anybody other than that. Now, I can give you a ton of evidence for this, but let me give you what Russian elites have said. And I mean, I was in their presence when they said it. 1996, when I was at the Army War College, we supported the biennial conference of European think tanks, and on condition that I, as the Russia person, go over. So I came to Moscow in January of 1996, and the weather was like it is outside in Washington today. It was 7 degrees in Moscow. And at this conference, the Russian hosts openly got up and in their welcoming address said, you know, we see Europe as being divided in two. You have NATO, which is controlled by the United States, and then, you know, the CIS, which is led by us. In other words, the best they could come up with back then was that Eastern Europe should not be in NATO, and that Russia dominated the former Soviet space and spheres of influence. In reply, the Ukrainian delegate got upset and said, thank you very much, but we intend to make our own mistakes. And they did, unfortunately. They made their own mistakes, and they're paying for it ever since. Nevertheless, you see that Russia cannot avoid imperial spheres of influence thinking. Second, the Russian government, in its words and deeds, and this includes their diplomats stationed abroad, since 1991, and I have the evidence for anybody who wants it, has refused to accept, despite the fact that it has signed all the treaties that you can name pertaining to these issues, has refused to accept either the territorial integrity or the sovereignty of any state east of Germany. And if they were to get to the Ukrainian border, they would immediately start trying to reimpose their influence on those states from the Baltic to the Black Sea by exploiting all the tensions there, ethnic, social, whatever. Because it is an axiom of Russian statecraft, most elegantly expressed by Catherine the Great, that I have no way to defend my frontiers except by expanding them. Now, that may have been true in the 18th century, but it's not true in contemporary Europe. And that's what I mean when I say that Russia has nothing to offer Europe. So if this crisis is unprovoked and fabricated, why now and why Ukraine? Well, as I said, Ukraine is the keystone in the arch of European security. As Zbigniew Brzezinski memorably said, without Ukraine, Russia cannot be an empire. An empire is what drives Putin and his entourage, because Putin has rebuilt the classic Muscovite patrimonial state, harmonizing Tsarist and Soviet motifs in it. And empire is the only form of state Russians have ever known. Whereas Great Britain and France had an empire and gave it up, Imperial Germany, that is, Hohenzollern Germany had an empire and gave it up. Russia is an empire and was an empire. And as Putin says, we have nowhere to retreat. Because if the issue is the survival of Putin's system, which is what drives all these people at the top, then the only way autocracy in Russia can survive is by imposing itself imperially on the rest of its neighbors. And that leads to a fundamental point that you cannot forget here. The perpetuation of empire in Russian policy is contradictory to the security of Europe, because Russia cannot recognize either the territorial integrity or sovereignty and independence of any other European state in its neighborhood. And it refuses really to recognize Asian states in that same way, just doesn't say so. And we're not talking today about Central Asia. So why Ukraine? Because Ukraine is critical to the perpetuation of the autocratic and imperial project that denotes Putin's reign in Russia. And without it, those projects remain incomplete, and as far as Putin is concerned, under threat from a democratic Ukraine. Why now? Because Putin sees, on the basis of his own structural imperatives, which I will get to, that Ukraine is moving towards NATO. And since it is an axiom of Russian governance that the West is an enemy of Russia and seeks to deny its empire, Ukraine is in danger of being lost for good. And with it, the consequences I have suggested for you with regard to empire and autocracy. This can't be allowed to happen. The other threats that Putin claims to be seeing and demands he is making about NATO are demands that go back to my youth, literally Khrushchev. The demand to get American nuclear weapons out of Europe, the demand for militaries to leave Central and Eastern Europe, the demand to get out of Romania and Bulgaria, the threat to use to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, the threat to deploy missiles in Cuba and Venezuela and elsewhere are all out of the Soviet playbook. And they suggest very strongly that in many respects, the Russian government today, not just Mr. Putin, but many of the other leaders of the government, like the French Bourbons, have learned nothing nor forgotten nothing. And they are still obsessed with a Soviet-type threat assessment. Indeed, I've written about 10 years ago when I was at the Army War College, said if you look at the official statement of the Russian government as to what are the threats, and they lay these out in their defense doctrines when they come out, they read like a Leninist document, or they read like something out of the movie Dr. Strangelove, that the West covets Russia's natural resources and is trying to seize them to prevent Russia from playing its rightful role. And I'm not using that analogy to be facetious, believe me. So, bearing that in mind, we should not have been surprised that Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014, and indeed I wasn't. I told a delegation of Ukrainians in 2013 here in Washington that if they signed the agreement with the European Union, not NATO, but the European Union, which is an association agreement, not even membership, Putin would invade. And they said that's the government's policy too. Because Putin had told Yanukovych, and the president of Ukraine, if you sign up with the EU, I will invade. And they believed him. Yanukovych refused to sign. Revolution in Ukraine broke out. He was overthrown, and Putin invaded. What we are dealing with here then is not the rational chess master that so much Western propaganda is talking about, or Mr. Putin has the United States and the West where he wants it, or that we have no idea what we're dealing with. That's not true. The Biden administration has done splendidly. What we are dealing with in Russia's case is an obsession with imperial status. And obsessives are not easily swayed by rational argument and do not see the world in the way you and I do. Indeed, the first point that people studying Russia must learn is that Russia is another cognitive universe. And therefore, you can't measure its potential and power by using American categories. There has to be understood in terms of its own frame of reference, which is possible if you study it, but they don't calculate the way you and I do about anything strategic or political. And they are obsessed with Ukraine, and even more obsessed with the idea that Russia, above all, has to have an imperial status. And you can't negotiate easily with people about their status. But what is true is that we can see analogies to this. And let me make that my final point. Those of you who are familiar with criminal organizations will know that one of the things that criminal organizations, mafia, for example, other such groups crave is respect, status, honor. Those of you who've seen the movies about The Godfather or The Sopranos or read the books and so on understand this. We see it also in criminal syndicates, say in Italy, where these groups in many cases originated. What we are dealing with here is a mafia-like government, and I'm not the first to say this, that is obsessed with status, sees threats everywhere, has an intelligence and security service structure that is incentivized and galvanized to provide the worst case threat assessment in order to maintain its budgets and status in the Russian government, and also because they know that'll play well with the boss. And therefore, a threat assessment and military system that sees the world in decidedly pathological terms. And the idea that you are dealing with, quote, the rational actor, a beloved of deterrence theory or of economic theory, at least up until recently, does not fully apply. They understand threats, and they may not be suicidal in intent, but they can become suicidal through miscalculation. And we have seen other cases in the past of imperial-minded governments fearing their loss of status that have completely misjudged situations and threats, and in a kind of hysteria, which is what we are now seeing in Russia, not only believed their own propaganda, but also started the world on the path of war. Best example here are the Habsburgs in 1914. Now, that does not mean there will be a world war here. Fortunately, cooler heads, I think, prevail in Europe and in the United States. But even if no hostilities break out with regard to Ukraine now, Mr. Putin is like Shakespeare's Macbeth, so far gone in blood that it would be just tiresome to go or is go back. He cannot stop the wars he has brought upon Russia, mainly the war with the West, but also, I think, the war with Ukraine. So even though we may escape renewed hostilities now, these crises will come back until the West is able to contain Russian power and the Russian people are able to govern themselves and obtain the true security, peace, and prosperity they need and deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so you've put together a lot of things, which I appreciate. Now I'm going to try to put together a lot of the questions. You put this in a tremendously historical perspective. And yet the last thing you said was, this is going to happen until the Russian people are able to govern themselves in some other way. The Russian people apparently never have been able to govern themselves in some other way. Is this hopeless? Are we just pushing all of this out to some future date?
No, it's not hopeless. We all have in common, or at least I think most of the people on this program, have in common an abiding interest in a state that had never governed itself, that had been destroyed 2,000 years early, and which nobody believed in his right mind believed would ever come to be. 74 years later, that state is thriving and is a major power in the Middle East, a democracy with flaws, albeit, but nonetheless a democracy, and a state that is doing very nicely. So it's not, nothing is hopeless. The same is true. I mean, Poland was not, Poland was never independent really, except for a 20-year period in 1919, and that didn't end well. You could say the same for the East European states and others. I mean, there's nothing eternally given in world history. I mean, things change. But Russian history, or Russian rulers rather, Russian rulers cannot think of a way to govern their country other than the way it was governed in the past. I mean, Putin's people actually get up and talk about justifying their desires for empire because of history. We were an empire, therefore we should be an empire now. They say this. I mean, that's one of the reasons they try to control the history.
So we have a comment from a listener that I'm going to attach to some questions.
Right.
And he says, I would like to discuss the internal political environment in Russia and the 2024 election. Economic misery, major pandemic deaths, waning support for Putin fatigue as drivers. He fears his ability, says the listener, to maintain power without a victory of some nature. So let's put this together with the questions. Does Putin, I know this is all calculations, does he think he can get what he wants without invading Ukraine, without taking his military forces? Is he judging the West, for example, as unable to stop him? Is he making a judgment about who we are, as well as who he is and what capabilities he has? So how much of this has to do with his view of us, and maybe this is the right moment to get something without invading? Another listener points out that he seems more aggressive now than he did during the previous administration. Is that a function of how he sees us?
Well, to bring this all together, all of your questioners have latched on to something very critical. I mean, I didn't have time in the presentation to talk about it, but all the domestic factors you talked about are driving this, because the only cards he can play are the motif of the besieged fortress, which is common in Russia, that everybody's against providential Russia, which is the only truly Christian country in Europe. So it's a very czarist motive. I mean, the Soviets used it. The only country believing in socialism, but Putin has restored the czarist point. His popularity is fading. The pandemic is ravaging Russia terribly. The figures are awful. And the economy is stagnant. There has not been any growth in any real sense since 2013, and precious little, and not enough before that either. It's run by a bunch of crooks in uniform, so to speak, or in suits. And totalitarian-like repression has increased. He is also convinced that the West is decadent, soft, corrupt, and all that. And there are a lot of people in the West who are going out of their way to validate that assessment. I mean, he just had a meeting yesterday with Italian businessmen who want to invest in Russia. I can't understand for the life of me why the Italian government let them go, but and we see what's happening in Germany, where the SPD, the Socialist Party, seems to have been wholly had lost its mind in a sense, and some of them are clearly corrupt with regard to supporting Russia against Ukraine. So yes, the domestic factors are a major driver of this crisis, because for for Putin, Ukraine is a domestic issue as well. And that's one of the reasons he has to come back winning. He can't afford a war where people get killed, and he can't afford to look weak. The US very rightly tried to say, okay, if you have concerns, let's talk about disarmament issues in Europe that would apply to both sides. And of course, Putin said, no, because that's not what he's really interested in. He wants to forcibly achieve a victory. What people have to understand here is that it is an intimidation culture, and the strategy is one of trying to retain escalation dominance throughout all phases of the crisis. The problem is that he's now embarked on an escalatory ladder, to use Herman Kahn's metaphor, which will be very difficult to get off of unless he goes to war, because nobody's going to give him what he wants politically. Nobody can. These are non-negotiable points.
Well, I guess the independence of Ukraine is a non-negotiable.
But it's not only the independence of Ukraine. No one in NATO is going back to 1997. NATO is not going to abolish Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. And they have, said that one day Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO. Not now. But the fact of the matter is there's no threat. I mean, if you look at the number of forces NATO has in Eastern Europe, there's no threat to Russia.
Well, that's why I asked you if Putin looks at this and says, this may be my maximum moment for war, because there's no force that can be arrayed against me that's worth having. There's no NATO force that matters. There's no American force that's going to come to Europe and support Ukraine. How well would Putin do with dead soldiers coming back to Russia? Is that something that stops him, or is that just part of the cause? We remember Afghanistan, it was a major influence factor.
It's not so much the fact of dead soldiers, that doesn't help. The real test in Russian history, and Afghanistan is a perfect example of this, is that protracted war puts the Russian state, whatever its nature, puts the Russian state to the supreme test. And often it has either failed or come close to failing. Now, therefore, Russian rulers, including Soviet rulers, generally understood that you can't go down that road because you're putting your power in jeopardy. Now, sometimes they were forced into that. Sometimes they mistakenly blundered into that and had no choice. But in 1914, it's not the army that fails, it's the state and the economy. In 1941, I mean, the state almost failed. Stalin at one point actually ran away to his dacha, as we know. And in 1946, he gives a speech saying that there are no other people like the Russian people because they could have said, enough of you, get out. And they didn't, but he understood this dynamic. His successors did also, at least for the most part, but that doesn't mean they can't make mistakes like Afghanistan. Ukraine, he knows now, is not going to be a cakewalk. On the other hand, he has made so many demands and threats. And as I said, he's like Macbeth. He's killed so many people, he's committed so many crimes and made so many threats that that if he were to go back, people are going to say, why did you go into Ukraine in the first place? And why did you try to frighten people when you knew you couldn't do it? And it's going to undermine him at home.
Okay.
So he has put himself in a position where he has fewer and fewer alternatives or courses of action, would be a better phrase. Fewer courses of action open to him. So all this talk about the great calculating chess master, turned out to be overblown. Yes, he's a very calculating man. He's done quite well in many respects, but he's also done quite well because he's been playing with amateurs on the other side and you can see that. And he has come to believe his own propaganda that the West is totally soft, corrupt, and so on. And he may believe that he can somehow, brazen it through and intimidate the West into surrender, but that's not going to happen. The Biden administration is not what he's been dealing with before. And I mean, people have to realize that here. I'm not saying this out of partisan assessment, but if you look at the way they've held the alliance together and have calmly rebuffed him and are actually made public with the British, what he's trying to do in Ukraine, they have thwarted a lot of Putin's objectives, and he never expected that.
So he thought we would give him a quick entry into Ukraine, and now if he's looking at this and saying, okay, I didn't get it the easy way, and you think that could cause him to make a miscalculation that drives a war process, is it in the interest of the West to offer him an off-ramp? One of the things we didn't talk about, I mean, I asked you not to mention it, and I wasn't going to mention it either, but one of the things we didn't mention is actual Ukraine. The Ukrainians have said they will not go back to the treaty process. They won't go back to the negotiating process. And we haven't told them they have to. Is it conceivable that we can push the Ukrainians to do what they were supposed to do under the Minsk Treaty and offer Putin a way to step back? Now, I know it doesn't answer your long-term theory, the long-term understanding of this, which is that Putin wants the empire and he wants Ukraine. But could it be a way to stymie the process for a little while?
Well, the Minsk process is a flawed one. For the benefit of the audience, the Minsk agreements refer to a series of agreements negotiated at Minsk in 2015, when the Russian army had just defeated the Ukrainians, and it really held a gun to Ukraine's head. The participants are Russian. Well, the Russians won't admit that their troops are in Ukraine to begin with. The treaty, the agreements, it's not a treaty, the agreements called on the separatists in Russia to withdraw their troops under UN supervision to certain pre-designated positions, and for Ukraine to institute constitutional reforms that would change Ukraine into a confederation. Now, what you have to understand about confederations is that they are a very weak form of state. In our own experience here, the Confederate States of America is a perfect example. Any one or two provinces, in this case, the Donbass, could basically paralyze the entire government of the state or threaten to secede. You know, if you studied American history, you're familiar with the situation. And as it's also like 18th century Poland, which fell apart on this kind of basis. And as a result, it was essentially a suicide pact for Ukraine. Now, the interesting point is that not only did Ukraine refuse to accept this, the Russians have never accepted any point pertaining to their responsibilities coming out of the Minsk Accords. So nobody has followed it. So Russia is in no position, has no standing, as we would say, to tell Ukraine, either you obey this or else, or tell the United States, because they believe Ukraine just goes like that when we snap our fingers, that you have to push Ukraine to accept this and we'd be happy with that. We're not going to do that. We're not going to tell Ukraine to commit suicide, to avoid being murdered. Moscow refuses to understand this. They may think that the French and Germans will do that, but Kiev isn't going to listen to France and Germany in this respect either. And I doubt France will. As for Germany, we have no idea where Germany is right now. So I can't speculate as to what it might do. But the Minsk agreement is not a basis for peace. The Russian invasion of Crimea is the most egregious aggression that has taken place since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait 32 years ago.
Okay, we had a couple of people comment on your comment about US policy holding NATO together, and then you just said that we don't know what the Germans are doing. But one thing that does seem to be clear is that Germany is not on the same page as the UK and the United States as far as talking to the Russians, and that's probably because it's winter and the Russians have cut back the gas and it's cold. It's not clear to me or to a couple of our questioners that NATO is holding together terribly well here. Is there the possibility, terrible possibility, that one of the side effects of this is that NATO, I wouldn't say disintegrates, no one's going to leave NATO, I don't think. But one of the side effects is to uncover the rifts in NATO between Germany, which needs Russian gas more than a lot of other people, and the other guys.
Well, you're quite right. And it would be the case, especially if the political agreement that came about as a result at the end of this was one that sold out Ukraine, because it would devalue NATO and expose the rifts there, and the European Union, and they shouldn't be left out of this discussion. NATO is still standing together. The Germans excuse me, the Germans' equivocation is very detrimental. But the fact of the matter is that if Putin invades Ukraine, it will be swept away. The reasons for it, don't only pertain to the supply of energy, and Russians also have bought into energy storage. There's a fair amount of corruption, and one has to say this there. There's also this belief that we have to continue to deal with Russia because we live with Russia, and the only way it's going to change is through rapprochement with Russia, and also opening up Russia to the German business, because the German foreign policy is very much an economic foreign policy. And then finally, you get the bizarre statement by the new foreign minister that we did it because of history. You have to remember that we invaded the Soviet Union and killed 27 million people, and 15 million of those were Russian. Well, yeah. 12 million of those were, Baltic, Belarus, and Ukraine, Jews, what else? They don't seem to feel they owe anything to Ukraine, despite having murdered millions of Ukrainians. I don't understand this logic, frankly. To me, it's the logic of people who are afraid and are trying to hide it from themselves. So you have a multiplicity of motives here, which the Russians, of course, exploit relentlessly. But I do think that if the Russians invade, Nord Stream 2 will go, and Germany will be in the game. And that much is, if it's clear to me, it should be clear to Putin. So, yeah, you can try to exploit these rifts all you like. I don't think it's going to get them very far.
Okay. Let's turn to another place for a moment. I mean, still Russia, but the other side of Russia. As Russia does this in the West and looks at Ukraine, it's also increasing its contacts and its exercises and its political engagement with China, which is another thing that drives the United States crazy. Is this a choice of Russia because they see the United States as vulnerable at this moment, and that we wouldn't do anything to upset the kind of Russia, whatever Russia gets from its relationship with China, we won't upset that?
Well, let me make 2 points here. First of all, if you read US government statements, it does not drive the US crazy. Most US government statements, and this goes back to the Trump administration, maybe even before, does not take seriously the prospect of a Russo-Chinese alliance.
Why?
Because they think—
I mean, I would take it seriously. Why don't they?
Well, to answer your question, because they don't believe that Russian interests ultimately converge with those of China, and that the Russians will not accept the Chinese being number one forever. In my profession, most people think that, obviously that they've grown closer, and that it's based on their opposition to American power and American policy and American values, to all three of those. I believe it's an alliance, de facto, not de jure, and that it's particularly dangerous in the military sphere and getting more dangerous. I'm actually writing about it right now, and that we actually see the Chinese and Russians learning from each other and doing more things together. So I've been fighting this battle for a long time to try to get people to understand just how serious I think this is. But it is also true that the Chinese have been noticeably quiet. I mean, they said they support Putin's demands once, but they've been noticeably reticent about coming out in public on this issue about Ukraine, because I think they understand that this is extraordinarily dangerous, and that they stand to possibly lose a great deal if this really does go out of control. So it's an alliance. It's an alliance, as the Russian analyst Dmitry Trenin said, like those of the Tsars, 18th, 19th century. It's not NATO. It's not a binding alliance where if somebody attacks you, you come to my aid, I come to your aid, or vice versa. But I think it is an alliance for all intents and purposes, not an axis of convenience or an axis of collusion, as my colleagues have said. And it's a unique alliance. As a matter of fact, Xi Jinping told Putin last year, what we have is better than an alliance because we both have freedom of action. And we're not, and neither China, and you have to remember, both of them understand that when the Soviet Union and China were allies, it didn't end well. almost ended in a war between them. So nobody wants to go back to that. So they don't want to be bound to each other or by each other, but they are allied in many serious ways, affecting Asian security and international affairs in general.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time together, and I think we've learned a lot, and I'm more nervous than I used to be. People who tune in know that I like to end on a positive note. I like to find something so that I send you all off with a smile. May not happen today. Oh, and to the listener who sent several questions, I took your questions down. I'm sending them to Dr. Blank. We just didn't have time to get to them on the air, but I will take care of that. So as we come to our last question, Steve, what's out there that's positive for us? Is there something that we can look to that will help to restore calm in Europe, keep the NATO alliance together, remind Putin that he's not out there by himself and it's not 17th or 18th or 19th century Russia, and do all of this without killing anybody? Anyway?
Well, look, it's going to have to be a Russian retreat. And, we offered him a way out. I mean, if you look at, I don't know if the texts of what we wrote back to them have been made public. I don't think so. But the gist of it is that essentially we're prepared to discuss a whole series of military and arms control issues, confidence building, you might call them confidence building measures, that might assuage some of your concerns.
So then,
and they would be, I think it would be remiss on their part not to take this more seriously. But interesting, Prime Minister, he's not Prime Minister, Medvedev made an interview today where he said the best solution would be some sort of political diplomatic resolution. Now, maybe that's a hint. It's too early to say what's going to happen, but the intransigence with which they've approached things has not benefited them. The best argument really for Ukraine joining NATO is Vladimir Putin. And, all these people going, as I said, all these people saying that political science theory dictates this have forgotten that no state is going to commit suicide, and that the United States is not going to reenact what happened at Munich in 1938. So that's exactly what's going on now, same kind of crisis. And Ukraine will fight. And these are very hardy, tough people. Putin knows that. I have a hope that cooler heads will prevail. But he has gone so far out on the limb that he may not be able to crawl back.
So the upside, the positive side, is that Putin, the realist, may prevail, and he may understand that he's overstepped. And on the other side, the negative side of this question is that he may understand all those things and not be able to step back.
Well,
I'm not sure that leaves us in a very positive place.
Well, but this is a crisis that was fabricated out of thin air and didn't need to be there. It tells you that we're not dealing, this idea of the rational chess master is way overblown. I mean, he's a calculating individual, sure. All politicians are. But that doesn't mean they calculate rightly.
Okay, I'm going to have to accept that as the final word. It is, I think, a first for us that we're leaving on a less than positive note. But thank you very much for a realistic discussion and a great way to balance what we read in the newspapers here about US policy against what's actually happening in Russia. This has a lot to do with Russia, and I think now we understand it better. Steve Lang, thank you very much for being with us. Everyone else, we hope to see you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you, everybody.